At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. In this program, we've traveled to the southernmost part of the Greek mainland, to an area known as the Peloponnese. It's a peninsula with an area of close to 21,500 square kilometers, and it's linked to central Greece by a very narrow isthmus. In geographical terms, it's akin to a very thin thread, so the Peloponnese is actually more like a large island, which means its coastline and beaches are a major attraction. But this is also a place of snow-capped mountains, vineyards and olive groves, and of course, a rich variety of historical sites. Over the next 2 millennia, feudal city-states were established across the region, the most powerful of them being Sparta. But others were important too, including Corinth, which is where we once again encounter the Apostle Paul. On his missionary journeys, Paul rarely stayed anywhere more than a couple of months, but he made Corinth his home and even set up a business there. Traveling west from Athens, as Paul would have done towards the end of AD 50, the overland route to Corinth crosses the narrow isthmus which today is pierced through the middle by the Corinth Canal. Completed in 1893, it took 11 years to cut down through the limestone to sea level. There are no locks, and the canal is just 24.6 meters wide. But by connecting the Aegean Sea to the Gulf of Corinth, it bypassed a 350-kilometer sail around the Peloponnese coast. Due to the narrowness, which is accentuated by the sheer banks rising to 70 meters at some points, any ship over 800 tons has to be towed through the Corinth Canal, and perhaps not surprisingly, there's a toll to pay. The current changes direction every 6 hours with the tides and has a near constant speed of 2.5 knots. Particularly unusual are 2 submersible road bridges, one at each end of the canal, which drop into the water to allow vessels to proceed. If you have a spare hour, it's a remarkable procedure to watch. When Paul arrived in Corinth, the Peloponnese was under the control of the Romans, who had captured the entire peninsula by 146 BC. The city's location at the end of this narrow strip had both strategic and commercial importance. Most of the ancient Hellenistic city was destroyed by the Romans as they invaded. But in 44 BC, Julius Caesar re-established Corinth as a major settlement. By the time Paul arrived, it was once again a thriving center of commerce and politics. But unlike either Athens or Thessaloniki, it was essentially a modern, cosmopolitan city with a much more progressive outlook and less rooted in either mythology or traditional ways of thinking. It also had a long-held reputation for sexual immorality, although this had diminished under Roman rule. On one hand, then, Paul may well have hoped that the free-thinking Corinthians might be more receptive to his message. On the other, the city's reputation for a less inhibited lifestyle would have disturbed him and possibly represented more of a challenge than overcoming the worship of pagan gods. Any doubts he may have had about staying in Corinth were soon put to rest by a vision from God. Appearing to Paul one night, God says in the book of Acts, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. Any view of ancient Corinth is dominated by the Acrocorinth, a substantial rocky outcrop on top of which was built the archaic period acropolis, including a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Joining us again is Dr. Michael Scott.
Acrocorinth, one of the most dominating landscapes in central Greece. The mountaintop overlooking the isthmus, the joining corridor between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. For centuries, from archaic times right the way through to the 19th century, the seat of a fortress, a citadel, to guard over, oversee, control this major crossing point. In archaic times, it was a city that had at its heart a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, sex, and fertility. And one of the ancient writers tells us a rather curious story about this temple, that it was home to 1,000 prostitutes. The sailors putting into the port of Corinth down below seem to have been having a very good time indeed. But the protective city walls of that archaic fortress were felled by the Romans when they took charge of Greece in 146 BC, and when they destroyed Corinth and everything in the surrounds to make a very bold statement about their dominance. Those walls weren't rebuilt, indeed, until the Byzantine period, when once again Acrocorinth became the fortress citadel that protected, controlled, and guarded over the crucial crossing point of Greece.
Paul would have undoubtedly seen this as he entered the city, and although the temple was in ruins, he'd know of its associations with mass prostitution. Rising to over 500 meters, the Acrocorinth was easy to defend, and so particularly during the later Byzantine period, it was very heavily fortified. The ruins of ancient Corinth seen today are mostly of the Roman settlement as rebuilt by Julius Caesar, and so much of the layout would have been very familiar to Paul after he made the city his home. There are very few relics here from the 600 years of Greek activity, but the one notable exception is what remains of the Temple of Apollo, with its 7 surviving Doric pillars, and which dates back to around 540 BC. There were originally 38 pillars, each monolithic, which means they were hewn from a single piece of stone rather than built up in round sections, which is more commonly seen in ancient Greek temples, including the Parthenon. Excavations began on this site in 1896 and have since gone on continuously, interrupted only by the Second World War. Virtually everything that can be seen here has been uncovered during the last 100 years. In addition to the civic buildings of the Roman era, a notable element of these ruins is the number of buildings that served as shops, reminders of the city's role as a key commercial center. Jason Harris, a visiting assistant professor from Tulane University in Los Angeles, has worked on the site of ancient Corinth for several years and is particularly aware of its significance.
I've had the privilege of working for several years here at the excavations in the museum and seeing really firsthand the wonders and the amazing sort of process it is to discover all of these finds, whether they're the temples, whether they're coins, pottery, all sorts of various finds here. So it's really also interesting at these sites like Corinth, Olympia, the Acropolis in Athens to understand the modern history of the excavations, how they played into the modern Greek state, and also how cultural heritage really plays a role in creating a relationship between the past and the present.
Alongside the old road to Corinth's western side harbour at Lechion is what was once an arcade of shops, and these provide a very good idea of how small retail operations would have looked like when Paul started plying his trade here. The Book of Acts says he met a couple called Aquila and Priscilla, who along with the entire Jewish population of Rome had been expelled by the Emperor Claudius. The writer of Acts notes, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them.
So when Paul came for approximately 18 months, from 51 to 52 AD, what he found was a very large city of several 100,000 people that was very, very cosmopolitan in nature, with various religions living together, including Greeks, Romans, and many Jews, many of whom had come from Rome in 49 AD when they had been expelled by the Emperor Claudius. And so really, when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, what you see is Paul dialoguing with the Corinthian people about really what it means to live in a contemporary world, to reconcile their beliefs with the customs of the Greeks and the Romans around them. So really the site of Corinth, as an important political and economic center in the Roman Empire, really provides a place for us to see the relationship between reconciling one's Christian beliefs and contemporary culture. And so you see this relationship that Paul has with the church, trying to understand how he can connect the church with the culture, especially not only just reconciling Christianity with Greek and Roman religion, but also Christianity and Judaism, because the many Jews that were here were not necessarily fans of Paul and what he was doing, as we see in Acts 18.
Could all this normality last for Paul? Of course not. Eventually, a group of Jews attack him and bring him before the region's proconsul, or governor, Gallus. Paul is accused of persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Here, in the center of what would have been the Roman agora, or forum, Paul was stood in front of a bema to face judgment. In his letters to both the Romans and the Corinthians, Paul referred to the bema as God's judgment seat, before which all must eventually stand. Paul no doubt thanked God for his acquittal, as the alternative could have been jail, but it's more likely to have been a public flogging. This was particularly barbaric, as you were stripped and then chained to a stone column as if you were embracing it, thus fully bearing your back for maximum exposure to the lash. Near the bema at Corinth is an inscription in both English and Greek. "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison." Providing a very tangible link with the New Testament is a small slab of stone bearing an inscription. It's part of a pavement, and the inscription commemorates the person who paid to have it laid, a wealthy politician called Erastus. Once you've absorbed the big picture at Corinth, the fascinating archaeological museum on the site fills in many of the smaller details. Built in the early 1930s, it houses an extensive collection of finds from the many decades of excavations, including household items and artworks from vases to figurines, many of them distinctly Corinthian in character and style. Near the entrance is a welcoming committee of headless statues, which, as they're wearing togas, would have been of notable Roman citizens. The book of Acts tells us that after appearing before Gallus, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. But eventually he decided it was time to leave. We're told he went to the harbour at Kenthria, which is on the eastern side of the city. Before setting sail, he had all his hair cut off in order to fulfill a vow. There's not much of the ancient harbour at Kenthria left now, except for a few foundations. But it's not hard to imagine Paul sitting here at the water's edge while a barber shaved his head. We're not sure what the vow was about, but it's been suggested that Paul may have been giving thanks for the protection God had promised him 18 months ago, and had very clearly provided. By now, Paul was much more notorious for his fearless preaching of the gospel, and forces were gathering against him. As he again prepared to sail once more from this harbour, this time to Jerusalem, word arrived of a plot to murder him, so the voyage was abandoned, and instead he set off eastwards on foot. Well, that was going to be quite a walk, but it didn't seem to deter Paul. Undoubtedly, one of the most famous locations on the Peloponnese is here at ancient Olympia, the location of the original Olympic Games. These games were staged every 4 years, from 776 BC to AD 394. The idea being that all nations forgot their differences for a little while and came together in the spirit of sporting competition. What is particularly interesting about Olympia is that it was built specifically for the Games, and so there wasn't a resident population.
Olympia is best known as the home of the Olympic Games, those centres of incredible competition, sweat, blood, tears that went every 4 years from 776 BC, the first ever Olympic Games, and which continue all the way through to today. But that kind of competition was not actually the only kind of competition going on at Olympia. Olympia was a sanctuary to the god Zeus, king of the gods, and as a result was a very valuable piece of property, of real estate. And different Greek cities fought one another to have control of the sanctuary. When it was excavated, there are literally black layers of ash, which are moments when another city has got control of it, burn everything to the ground, and just started again building. This is a place that had competition in its essence, in its lifeblood. And it managed to survive all the way through changes of powers. So when the Romans took over Greece, they absolutely loved the Olympic Games. The Emperor Nero even came to compete in the Olympic Games, and strangely enough, won every event that he entered. And even when the Roman era gave way to the Christian era, Olympia managed to survive, for some time at least, until in the 5th or 6th centuries AD, finally, the competitors stopped competing.
After the Games were banned by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I, the site was progressively abandoned and subsequently ravaged by both earthquakes and floods until it all but disappeared. It was rediscovered in 1766, and excavations began in 1829, uncovering a complex of temples, treasuries, hostels, baths, and of course, sports venues. This is the Palestra, where the wrestlers and boxers were trained, and it's part of a group of buildings that were known collectively as the Gymnasium. The word gymnos, or gymnos in Greek, means naked, and the athletes in these times trained and competed in the nude. The Palestra was built around a courtyard which served as the training area, and in the building were dressing rooms, baths, and storage areas. The main stadium at Olympia is now just a flat area, but it would have originally been surrounded by a racetrack and had many tiers of seats made from mud arranged on either side. The very first games were held in honor of Zeus, the god of sky and thunder, and the temples uncovered on the site of ancient Olympia are to him and his wife Ira. It's here, at the temple of Ira, that the Olympic flame is lit by concentrating the rays of the sun with a parabolic mirror, and the torch then heads off on a relay around the world to the location of the summer or winter games. The games were still an important part of life in Greece when St. Paul was here, and he later used sporting analogies in some of his writing, including in his letter to the church at Phillipi when he says, "I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus." Late afternoon light really bring these ruins to life on a summer day. A little further down the west coast of the Peloponnese is the small town of Pylos, often described in the guidebooks as the most picturesque on the peninsula. This is quite an accolade, as this part of the peninsula has more than its fair share of beautiful seaside towns, but Pylos is indeed a gem among them. While it dates back to Mycenaean times, Pylos is more famous for an episode from more recent history. At the time of the Greek War of Independence, Pylos was called Navarino. And, as had been the case for many centuries, its beautiful bay was once again considered strategically important. A large Ottoman armada was at anchor in the harbour at Pylos when a small but well-armed flotilla of just 13 ships from France, England and Russia started manoeuvres, primarily aimed at convincing the Turks to comply with the newly signed Treaty of London.
In 1821, the Greeks decided that they had had enough of Ottoman rule that had been going on since about 1453. And so began the Greek resistance. But this was fiercely opposed by the Ottomans. Greece was an important economic part of their empire, but also strategically, if Greece left, who would be next? And the Greeks were frankly outnumbered, outgunned and outspent. By 1825, 1827, their cause had advanced very little and looked frankly desperate. But what came to their aid was a wider geopolitical power play. Russia was very keen to see Greece liberated from the Ottoman Empire, not just because they shared an Orthodox Catholic faith with Greece, but because they saw an opportunity to expand their own power from the Black Sea downwards into the Mediterranean. Britain and France, on the other hand, were very keen that Russia did not expand its influence in such a way. And so in 1827, Britain, France and Russia agreed in a treaty that they would help Greece on the condition that as a result, Greece remained autonomous, free. And so the Battle of Navarino came about on the 20th of October, 1827, between the forces of the Ottoman Empire and the combined warships of Britain, France and Russia. That was the last battle in history to be fought entirely by sailing ships, although in reality, it was the firepower of Britain, France and Russia that won the day.
It's said that the bay turned red. The Battle of Navarino is credited with saving the fledgling Greek Republic from collapse, and some of the wrecks of the Turkish vessels are still discernible in the clear waters, now back to their customary aquamarine. However, they do glow red again during the bay's legendary sunsets. Across the Gulf of Messenia is the Mani region, a rugged peninsula of steep mountains and valleys, sheer cliffs and rocky beaches, and sturdy little villages, seemingly hanging on for dear life. This is Greece at its wildest, and because of the inaccessibility and the challenging terrain, Christianity came much later to this region. Additionally, the local people, known as the Maniotes, were fiercely independent as well as being highly superstitious, so it wasn't until the 10th century that Christian missionaries made many significant inroads. So, when Christianity finally conquered Greece's harshest region, it did so decisively and comprehensively, much like had happened in the rest of the country in the centuries before. In the Peloponnese, it all started with Paul's first visit to Corinth, where, although there was some opposition, his message resonated with enough people, and from different walks of society, to ensure it would spread across Greece and out to the wider world. Leaving the southern end of the Peloponnese, we head back to Athens, so we can sail from the port of Piraeus south into the Aegean Sea, heading for the glorious Greek islands with their evocative palettes of blue and white and reputation for thoroughly enthralling visitors. Passing through the magnificent Cycladic Islands, it would be tempting to stop, but our destination is the farthest group called the Dodecanese. These islands are closer to the Turkey's western coastline than they are to the Greek mainland. The largest in the group is Rhodes, a distillation of all Greece's many attractions into one highly concentrated experience. But we are also interested in Patmos, which has a very special association with the Bible. Described as the sunniest corner in Greece, the Dodecanese group comprises 12 larger islands with numerous smaller ones dotted in between. Here are the sparkling beaches that make these islands one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Mediterranean. But these islands also have a rich cultural variety, born out of a long and sometimes tumultuous history. Much of this history parallels what was happening on the mainland. So these islands were first inhabited and civilized through the archaic and classical periods, eventually becoming part of the voracious Roman Empire. Following its demise in the 4th century AD, there was nearly a millennium of Byzantine rule. Subsequent periods of control by the Venetians, the Catholic Knights Hospitaller, the Ottomans and the Italians have all left their distinctive marks on the Dodecanese Islands.
The island of Rhodes, it's said, was born as a result of a coupling between the god Helios, the sun, and the nymph Rhodes. And Rhodes, the island, became an extremely important harbour within the wider Aegean and Mediterranean worlds, fought over by many of its kings and potentates. At the end of the 4th century BC, one of those kings tried to take the island for his own. He lost, and the Rhodians turned the plunder they got as a result into what became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus, statue of the god Helios, the sun, that stood bestriding the entrance to the harbour at the city of Rhodes. And for centuries after that, Rhodes continued to occupy the position of great trading point within this Mediterranean network. In 600 AD, we hear about the Rhodian sea laws. They were still controlling the waves. And then, in 1309, a new chapter in Rhodes' history began with the arrival of a new conqueror, the Knights Hospitaller.
In Acts 21, we read that the Apostle Paul visited Rhodes. Sailing from the island of Kos, he stopped here on his return to Jerusalem. Rhodes has a population of 120,000 people, which increases significantly in summer. In historical terms, it's perhaps best known for the Colossus of Rhodes. Built in the 3rd century BC to celebrate the island's victory over Cyprus, the Colossus was destroyed by an earthquake in 226 BC. Today, 2 columns stand on the points where his feet were, one topped with a statue of a stag, the other with a doe, the symbols of Rhodes. Plenty of history has survived on Rhodes, though perhaps nowhere more dramatically than in the island's capital, also called Rhodes, with its medieval old town, Italian-style harbour area and ancient acropolis, which dates back to the 4th century BC. It's quite a mixture. Dominating the central harbour area, the medieval old town is one of the finest examples in Europe, earning a listing as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. The fortifications are Byzantine in origins, but the Knights Hospitaller, who arrived on Rhodes in 1309, undertook a massive programme of upgrading and expansion, eventually creating 3 lines of solid defence. It's all been so beautifully preserved or restored that walking these narrow streets really feels like a pleasant stroll back in time. Particularly fascinating is the Street of the Knights, lined with the hostels called the Inns of the Tongues, where each of the 7 different nationalities of the order stayed. Each bears the respective tongue's emblem, carved in stone above the arched entrance.
In the 7th century AD, a group was formed in Jerusalem to look after the sick and ill pilgrims who had managed to make their way to the Holy City. And in the aftermath of the First Crusade in the 11th century, that group was transformed from a group of doctors into a military fighting force whose job it was to protect the pilgrims and protect Christendom's hold over the Holy Lands. These were the Knights Hospitaller. And their power and influence grew in the Levant and the Holy Land exponentially over the following centuries. But then, in the 13th century, they were chased out of the Holy Land by the Ottoman Turks. They needed a new base. First, they landed on Cyprus, but soon their eyes turned to the island of Rhodes, and in 1309, they took the island by force. The city of Rhodes was, as a result, transformed into a medieval fortress, and there the knights, now called the Knights of Rhodes, remained until the 16th century, when in 1522 they were once again chased from their homes by the Ottoman Turks.
Rhodes makes the most of its location, so there are water views and beaches on nearly all sides, providing plenty of vantage points from which to appreciate a stunning sunset over the Aegean. Head a little further south and the road takes you to Lindos. Surely the realization of everybody's imaginings of the classic whitewashed Greek village hugging an ocean of brilliant blue. In fact, Lindos is built around not one, but two equally beautiful bays, so there are two stretches of beach to choose from. The more sheltered of these inlets is called St. Paul's Bay, and it's claimed the apostle took refuge here from a storm in AD 43, and by happy accident bringing Christianity to the island of Rhodes. While there isn't much evidence to back up this story, Paul certainly would have sailed through these waters on both his second and third missionary journeys, passing quite close to Rhodes, so it might have happened. And one legacy is a very pretty little chapel dedicated to the apostle, nestling at the base of the Acropolis. While the beaches are a major attraction of Lindos, its spectacular ancient Acropolis is well worth a visit too. Rising to 120 meters above the village, access is by long flights of stone steps, ending in a vaulted corridor. There's a lot to see up here, including the remaining columns of a stoa, originating from around 200 BC, and a propylaeum or monumental gateway dating from the 5th century BC. Beyond are the ruins of the temple of Athena of Lindos, the most important on the site, and from 300 BC.
The Acropolis on the eastern end of the island of Rhodes is dedicated to the goddess Athena and particularly to Athena Lindia. Now, this was an incredible sanctuary and a very savvy one by my bet. It had a beautiful temple and other sanctuary architecture, but then in about the 1st century BC, it suffered a disaster. Everything that it owned was burnt by fire. And as a result, what could this sanctuary say to those coming to the island about its former glory? Their answer was a brilliant one. They started writing inventory lists of every dedication that had ever been bought by anyone in the past. And basically, they made it up. Every single important character in the whole of Greek mythology and Greek history supposedly had turned up to the Acropolis of Athena Lindia and dedicated something in the sanctuary. The Romans, when they started coming, took note of these lists and wanted to be on them themselves. And so this brilliant history continued right the way through into the 14th century AD, when the new owners of Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of Rhodes, decided to turn the Acropolis of Athena Lindia into a new fortress.
Sharp-eyed film buffs may recognize that scenes from the guns of Navarone were filmed here, although the movie's plot is actually inspired by the Battle of Leros, which took place during the Dodecanese campaign in the Second World War. The real island of Leros is at the northern end of the Dodecanese group and possesses the largest natural harbour in the eastern Mediterranean. During the 1930s, the Italians turned it into a naval base, and Mussolini subsequently positioned both ships and seaplanes here during the Second World War. Gun emplacements were put in place to defend the base, And when Italy changed sides in July 1943, a British force arrived as reinforcements. The Battle of Leros took place during the following September, as the Germans mounted many attempts to take the island. Remains of the gun batteries can still be seen on the island's cliffs, but today these are very serene locations and perfect places to watch another magical Aegean sunset. Today, Leros is a very peaceful place, its landscapes punctuated by little whitewashed chapels, like this beautiful little example, the church of Aios Isidros, built on a rocky islet on the Gulf of Kokali. In bad weather or high seas, it's often cut off from shore. The capital of Leros, Aia Marina, is notable for its distinctly Italianate architectural style, although you'll still find plenty of traditional whitewashed cottages in the neighboring villages of Platanos and Pandeli. Aia Marina is a port too, and its beautiful harbour's entrance is flanked by an old Roman fort called the Bruzzi, and an historical windmill which almost appears to be rising straight out of the water and can be seen from all parts of the island. Towering over all of it is the brooding presence of the Castro tis Panagias, the Castle of the Virgin Mary. Again Byzantine in origins and later modified by the Knights Hospitaller. Built into the west side of the fortress is the 17th century Panagia Church, also dedicated to Mary. Secluded beaches, gentle green hills, olive groves and pine forests endow Leros with a great natural beauty, and it's often described as Greece's secret paradise. And from any high point in the distance to the north can be seen the island of Patmos, which is only a short ferry ride away. Patmos is known variously as the Island of the Apocalypse, the Holy Island, or the Jerusalem of the Aegean. These are all references to the most famous of its historical residents, the Apostle John, who was exiled here in AD 95 by the pagan Roman Emperor Domitian. Patmos is remote by any measure, although its popularity with both tourists and Christian pilgrims alike means it's a lot easier to get to than when John was left to languish here. There are direct connections with Rhodes and Athens, as well as links to the other main islands in the Dodecanese group. This remoteness is the very reason the Romans in particular used Patmos as a place to exile political and religious dissidents. Patmos is a small island, but there's still a lot to see, much of it related to St. John. In fact, on this tiny island, there are said to be a total of 365 churches. There's also a remarkable variety of landscapes for such a small area. From wind-blown hills to calm coves, rocky outcrops to smooth beaches, and dry, barren slopes to lush groves of citrus trees, olives, and vines. But beyond the physical, this island has a mystical quality and a tranquil beauty that's spellbinding, especially when the sun is setting, bathing everything in soft, warm hues. In fact, walking up the steep hill from the shore to the cave where John was exiled is a most moving and spiritual experience. The first settlement dates back to 2000 BC, but it was the Ionians who brought a higher level of civilization in the 4th century, establishing a port town now called Scala, with an acropolis on the nearby Castelli Hill. Patmos developed into a trading center, but once the Romans took control in the 2nd century AD, it was better known as a place of exile. But one exile, John, would have a significant influence on the island's future right up to today. Almost 1,000 years after John, a monk called Christodoulos came here in 1088 from the island of Kos, seeking solitude in the tranquility of Patmos. He wrote, "The loneliness of the island made me jump for joy." With the blessing of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Christodoulos established a small monastery dedicated to the apostle, although he died before it could be completed. His followers finished the job, and this monastery was subsequently considered so sacred that it was even respected by the invading Ottomans and allowed to continue. Today, the fortress monastery dominates the skyline behind the narrow bay of Scala, its forbidding grey stone walls contrasting dramatically with the bright white of the houses in the surrounding village of Chora. When John was on Patmos, it wasn't uncommon for the exiles to live in one of the many caves on the island. It needs to be remembered that he was well into his 80s and most likely no longer capable of building a proper dwelling. A cave would have been a welcome refuge, if perhaps an uncomfortable one. Today, the Monastery of the Apocalypse stands over the cave where John is thought to have lived. Over the entrance to the cave is an inscription which reads, "As dreadful as this place is, it is nevertheless the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." In the cool darkness of this cave, John began seeing the visions that have subsequently formed the most controversial and most debated writings in the entire Holy Bible, the Book of Revelation. These visions were prophetic and told of the end of times, using symbolism that would have been understood by the readers of the day and surrealism that has remained open to different interpretations ever since. At the start of the Book of Revelation, John writes, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, 'Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches.'" In Greek, the word apokalypsis means revelation, and its English derivation, apocalypse, has come to imply destruction and devastation. God's revelation to John was essentially a message of hope. At least for the faithful who were promised that their persecutors would be destroyed, while they would be rewarded with eternal life. In the cave chapel can be seen the niche carved into the rock where John rested his head, and another which he used to pull himself up after waking. Another reminder that he was a very old man. For the many thousands of pilgrims who visit here every year, this is a very sacred spot. In the low ceiling are the clearly discernible fissures in the rock through which, according to tradition, John heard the voice of God. The wall paintings are from the 12th century, but were only discovered in 1973 when whitewash was removed. It's considered such a crucially important place in Christianity that a priest lives, sleeps, and stands guard here all year round, taking his appointed role very seriously. The current incumbent has been doing the job for over 20 years. Away from the bright Aegean light and the noises of everyday life, This quiet cave really concentrates the senses on the story of Revelation with its message of reassurance for believers. No wonder it's considered such a significant and sacred place in Christianity. Services are held here by the resident priest every day, and to attend one is a very moving experience.
Now, fairly soon after John's death, that cave started to become a place of Christian pilgrimage. And by about the 4th century AD, there seems to have been a church there to help celebrate the sanctity of the spot. But Patmos's history over the subsequent centuries was a very difficult one, as it was thrown between the different powers that controlled the Aegean. And it wasn't until the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, that we actually get a monastery there to celebrate the sanctity of the place, the monastery that still survives to this day.
The village of Chora is clustered around the fortified monastery. It's full of tiny squares and courtyards, narrow alleyways just waiting to be explored, beautifully restored period homes, and the promise of stunning views from every vantage point. Closer to the monastery, Chora's architecture is predominantly Byzantine and has been the subject of much study because of its particular character and style. These houses were built by refugees from the sacking of Constantinople in 1453, and so their urban-like density is unusual for what was then an entirely rural environment. Further down the slopes, the character changes again, as many of the buildings are freestanding mansions built in the 16th and 17th centuries during the Ottoman occupation. Most originally sat in large gardens, which have subsequently been occupied by smaller homes. The monastery itself feels very much like the refuge it was originally intended to be. While the outside world can be viewed in all its glory from the top of the walls, down in the courtyards and sheltered spaces, the focus is inward-looking and more contemplative. The interior of the main church is dominated by a carved wooden iconostasi, breathtaking in its intricacy and detail. It's early 19th century, but the building is the original, completed in 1095. The many chandeliers and lamps are made from silver, while the floor slabs are marble. On the roof terrace is the small domed chapel of the Holy Cross, built in 1558 and made from rough-cut stone. From up here, the whole of Patmos is spread out before you. A church of rather smaller proportions, but considered no less important in the story of St. John's time on Patmos, sits right on the harbour at Scala. It's built on the site where John baptized the first converts to Christianity on the island. One of the most unusual is on a large rock formation called Kalikatsu. It sits in the bay of Petra, not far from the very popular beaches at the village of Grikos. In medieval times, monks lived as hermits in small caves hewn into the rock, and there was even a small church here in the 11th century. Also known as Petra Rock, it's thought that the ancient residents of Patmos used the flat platform at the top as a place to worship Selene, the goddess of the moon. The monks carved steps into the rock, and the views of the bay from the top make the tricky climb well worth the effort. Another distinctive architectural feature of Patmos, as on many of the Greek islands, is its cylindrical stone windmills. These are from the 16th and 17th centuries and were carefully positioned to make the most of the prevailing northerly winds. Unlike in northern Europe, fabric sails were used instead of rigid vanes, but the effect was the same, driving a large grinding wheel to make flour from wheat, barley, or corn. After being abandoned in the 1950s and becoming derelict, these 3 windmills on the edge of Chora have been lovingly restored and are in working order today. St. John lived on Patmos for around 18 months, and after the Emperor Domitian was murdered in AD 96, it's believed he was returned to his home in Ephesus, leaving this little island a remarkable legacy, which has profoundly influenced its existence today. Beyond this, he left Christianity with an even more enduring legacy, which continues to underpin the faith in the most trying of times. There can be few places on the planet that compare to Patmos for its intoxicating mix of deep spirituality, sheer physical beauty, and wonderfully relaxed lifestyle. Devout Greeks believe that you should visit Patmos at least once in your lifetime, and it's hard not to agree. But sadly, it is here that we must leave Greece and its living history. From Christianity's first tentative steps into Europe, when St. Paul must have felt on many occasions overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead, to the resounding reassurances awaiting the faithful as revealed to St. John, as he too must have been struggling with his situation on Patmos, Greece is hugely significant in biblical terms. Athens, Thessaloniki, Veria, Phillipi, Corinth, and Patmos are all very significant places in the New Testament story, but if St. Paul was to visit Greece today, he would surely be astounded at how Christianity is such an integral part of the nation's life, from the major urban centers to the remotest of islands. But then perhaps he wouldn't be. Perhaps Paul's faith was always strong enough to believe that the message he brought just could not be ignored. And St. John's visions of the future must have convinced him too that what he was writing had implications for eternity. These were real people, and these are real places, which you can visit today for a truly inspirational experience. The ancient Bible destinations are a trip of a lifetime, or very possibly, a life-changing trip.